If you ask, just the average civilian to picture military leadership, they almost always conjure up the exact same image.
Right, it's the movie trope.
Exactly. It's always a drill sergeant,
Yeah.
veins popping out of their necks, just screaming at some terrified teenager in the pouring rain. We have this cultural assumption that military management is essentially just organized yelling.
It's a very pervasive myth, and I mean, that image is based on basic training, which is really just the initial onboarding
Right.
phase.
It's not the actual day-to-day reality.
Not at all. What we are looking at today is the operational reality of mid-level management. And in a highly complex, highly lethal environment, screaming simply does not scale.
Well, if you actually open the United States Air Force's leadership handbook, you don't find a manual on how to yell louder. You find this incredibly dense masterclass in cognitive psychology, environmental design, empathy, and systems engineering.
It is incredibly sophisticated and very clinical in its approach to human behavior.
And that is exactly what we are tearing apart today. So welcome to the deep dive. We take a massive stack of source material, strip away the jargon, and extract the insights that actually matter for you.
And today's material is particularly dense.
Oh, it's a monster. Today, we have our hands on the newly updated, heavily detailed February 15th, 2025 edition of the Air Force Handbook 1. We are specifically looking at chapters 13, 14, and 15, along with a supplementary document called the Airman Development and Testing Chart.
Which is, structurally speaking, the literal blueprint for how the Air Force transforms a tactical expert into a strategic leader.
Right, and in Air Force terms, that is the transition from a staff sergeant to a technical sergeant.
Exactly. You are moving from being someone who is very good at their specific technical job to someone who manages the systems and the people doing the job.
And I really want to set the ground rules for how we are going to explore this with you today, because the military evaluates this transition in a really fascinating way. The testing chart we have doesn't just list facts to memorize.
No, the Air Force categorizes simple fact memorization as level A comprehension. And for this specific rank transition to technical sergeant, they completely discard level A.
Wait, really? They don't test the basics?
They assume you already know the technical specs of your jet or the coding language of your cyber unit. To become a technical sergeant, the evaluation strictly targets what they call level B and level C comprehension.
Let's define those, because that's the framework for our entire conversation today.
So level B is understanding. This is the relationship logic. It's not just knowing that a regulation exists. It is understanding exactly why it exists, how it interacts with human nature, and how it connects to the broader mission.
You have to understand the machine itself.
Precisely. You understand the invisible architecture. Then you move to level C, which is applying. This is execution.
That's where the pressure comes in, right?
Yes. Under extreme stress with exhausted personnel, can you take that conceptual understanding and actually apply it to solve a human or systemic crisis?
I love this progression, and it's exactly how we're going to structure our journey for you today. We are going to just, walk through the manual page by page like a table of contents.
That would be incredibly dry.
Right. So we are going to start at the micro level, inside the mind of the leader. We have to figure out how a leader controls their own cognitive biases and stress responses.
Because if you can't manage your own brain, you certainly can't manage a team.
Exactly. From there, we'll move to the meso level. What happens when that leader steps out of their own head and has to manage the friction of other human beings? We're talking team dynamics, toxic high performers, and conflict.
And then finally, we'll zoom all the way out to the macro level.
Right. What happens when the team is perfect, but the organizational structure they are working inside is fundamentally broken?
It is a logical progression from the micro to the meso to the macro. You cannot rebuild an engine if you don't understand the physics of the metal, and you can't rebuild an organization if you don't understand the psychology of the people running it.
So let's dive straight into that psychology. The handbook starts its leadership section by talking about self-mastery. And the very first thing it tackles is mindset.
It draws a very hard clinical line between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset.
I've heard these terms thrown around in corporate seminars forever, but how does the military actually apply them?
Well, the underlying psychology here stems from researchers like Carol Dweck, though the manual focuses purely on the operational application. It's about how an individual perceives their own capacity.
Right, like how they view their own talent.
Exactly. A person with a fixed mindset believes that their intelligence, their talent, and their leadership abilities are static traits. It's binary. You either have the gift or you don't.
The danger there is how they react to failure, right?
That is the critical vulnerability. If you have a fixed mindset and you fail a mission or you bomb a presentation, you don't view it as a temporary setback. You internalize it as a permanent indictment of your core identity.
You think, I failed, therefore I am a failure.
Yes. So leaders with a fixed mindset become incredibly defensive. They actively hide their mistakes. They avoid taking risks because putting in effort is seen as proof that they lack natural talent.
Now put that on a flight line or in a nuclear silo. If an airman makes a mistake and has a fixed mindset, they might try to sweep that mistake under the rug just to protect their ego.
And in the military, hiding a mistake doesn't just hurt quarterly profits. It crashes an aircraft. It costs lives.
Which is why the Air Force explicitly demands a growth mindset from its technical sergeants.
A growth mindset is the fundamental belief that your abilities can be developed through dedication, hard work, and feedback. Failure is stripped of its emotional weight.
It just becomes data.
Exactly. It is no longer an attack on your identity. It is simply raw data telling you where to allocate more effort.
I want to pause on something in this section that genuinely surprised me. The manual talks about self-control, but it completely redefines how I've always thought about it.
How?
Well, I was raised to think of self-control as a moral virtue. You either have grit and discipline or you're weak. But this text treats willpower like a physical muscle.
Yes, the handbook introduces the concept of cognitive load and ego depletion. It explicitly states that self-control is a finite resource that gets depleted with heavy use.
So it's not unlimited.
Not at all. Every time you suppress an emotional reaction, every time you force yourself to focus on a tedious spreadsheet, and every time you resist a temptation, you are burning cognitive fuel.
That is radically progressive for a military document. I mean, the stereotype is just soldier on, push through the pain. But this is saying, no, biologically, you will run out of willpower.
It is a cold, clinical reality. The handbook advises that if a leader relies solely on their internal willpower to get through the day, they will eventually collapse under the friction.
So what's the alternative?
The level C application here, the execution phase, is environmental design.
Give me an example of that. What does environmental design actually look like for a mid-level manager?
Let's say you are a technical sergeant, and you know that dealing with a specific administrative software always makes you lose your temper. It just burns through your patience.
Oh, I know that feeling. We all have that one software program.
Right. A poor leader tries to just tough it out and ends up snapping at their team later in the afternoon because their self-control is completely depleted.
Because they burn all their fuel on the software.
Exactly. A smart leader restructures the environment. They schedule that software task for the morning when their cognitive reserves are highest, or they delegate it, or they change the workflow entirely to remove the friction.
You don't fight the trigger. You remove the trigger.
Precisely. You manage your psychological resources just as strictly as you manage your unit's budget.
I'm thinking about this in my own life. If I want to stop eating junk food, trying to use willpower while staring at a bag of chips on my desk is a losing battle.
You will lose that battle every time.
By 4 p.m., my willpower muscle is exhausted and I'm going to eat the chips. The environmental design solution is to simply not buy the chips at the grocery store.
You architect the environment so that doing the right thing is the path of least resistance. And this concept of internal resource management flows perfectly into how the handbook handles acute stress.
Right. It introduces a physiological mechanism called positive reappraisal. And this part blew my mind. I read this section 3 times.
It is deeply biological.
It breaks down the literal cardiovascular response to how we mentally frame a stressful event.
Let's unpack the physiological reality of stress. The manual presents a very common scenario. You receive short notice that you have to deliver a high-stakes, highly technical briefing to a room full of senior commanding officers.
A total nightmare. My palms are sweating just thinking about it.
For most people, their brain immediately categorizes that event as a threat. When you frame an event as a threat, your body prepares for damage control.
Like a fight-or-flight response.
Yes. Your heart rate spikes, but more importantly, your blood vessels constrict. It's called vasoconstriction. Your body is literally trying to minimize bleeding in case you are attacked.
Wait, really? Just from public speaking?
The primitive parts of your brain cannot distinguish between a senior officer judging your PowerPoint and a predator chasing you through the woods. The physiological response is identical.
That is wild.
And the downstream effect of a threat response is that your cognitive functions narrow, you lose access to creative problem solving. And crucially, your recovery time is massive. It takes hours for your central nervous system to return to baseline.
So you were just physically exhausted for the rest of the day?
Completely drained. But positive reappraisal changes the biological equation entirely.
How did that work?
It is the deliberate cognitive strategy of reframing that exact same event not as a threat, but as a challenge. You tell yourself, this briefing is difficult, the stakes are high, but I have the resources, the training, and the competence to handle it.
This is an opportunity to prove my unit's value. But does just telling yourself that actually change your biology?
It does. When the brain perceives a challenge rather than a threat, you still get the adrenaline bump. You need that energy to perform. But your blood vessels dilate instead of constricting.
Oh, wow. So vasodilation instead of vasoconstriction.
Yes, your heart pumps more blood, bringing more oxygen to your brain. You remain cognitively flexible. And the manual specifically notes that when framed as a challenge, your heart rate, pulse, and blood pressure return to normal significantly faster after the event.
So the way a leader internally narrates their reality literally dictates their cardiovascular health and their cognitive endurance.
It is a biological constraint. If a technical sergeant is running around treating every missing wrench or late report as a mortal threat, they are going to physically burn themselves out. They become an operational liability.
And an anxious, burnt-out leader cannot communicate effectively, which is the next critical pillar that text addresses.
Because once you have mastered your internal mindset, you have to project that outward. Communication in the Air Force is not considered a soft skill. It is a foundational tactical competency.
The manual uses an acronym to define the standard for communication. Focus US. Focused, organized, clear, understanding, and supported.
It is a rigorous standard.
I'm usually allergic to corporate acronyms, but this one actually carries a lot of weight when you break it down.
Let's analyze the mechanics of focatus. Focused means the communication addresses the specific issue, the whole issue, and absolutely nothing but the issue. There is zero tolerance for meandering.
That's straight to the point.
Organized means the information flows in a logical, systematic progression that the audience can easily anticipate. Clear requires precise articulation, no ambiguous language.
And what about understanding?
Understanding means you have actively tailored the message to the audience's current knowledge level. You don't use high-level strategic jargon with junior enlisted airmen, and you don't waste a general's time explaining basic technical specs.
And the last one is supported. In a military context, I assume that doesn't just mean cheering someone on.
No, supported means your argument is built on a foundation of verifiable logic and empirical evidence. It means your position cannot be easily dismantled by a skeptical audience because you have provided the structural support of hard data.
To achieve that FOSIA standard, the manual outlines the 7 steps for effective communication.
It's a very deliberate workflow.
Right. It starts with analyzing your purpose and audience, researching the topics, supporting your ideas, organizing an outline, drafting, editing, and then step 7 is fight for feedback and get approval. I really want to talk about that phrasing. Fight for feedback. That is so aggressive.
It is deliberately aggressive. The Air Force knows that human beings naturally suffer from pride of authorship.
Oh, absolutely. When we spend hours writing a plan or building a briefing, our ego gets attached to it.
We don't want people to poke holes in it.
We want a rubber stamp. We want people to say, great job, it's perfect.
But a technical sergeant operating at level C knows that a rubber stamp is dangerous. If you take a flawed plan into a live operational environment, the environment will expose the flaws unforgivingly.
The enemy gets a vote.
Exactly. So, the leader must actively fight their own ego and aggressively seek out peer criticism. You want your colleagues to tear your argument apart in the safety of an office so you can rebuild it before it ever reaches the commanding officer or the flight line.
That ties right back to the growth mindset. Feedback isn't an attack on your worth. It's a necessary stress test for the mission.
Precisely.
Now, shifting from how we build the message to how we actually deliver it. This manual gets surprisingly deep into nonverbal communication and public speaking anxiety.
It diagnoses it very clinically.
It lists these specific physical quirks that nervous speakers do. It calls them the life raft, the cage tiger, the rocker, and the too cool persona. Reading these descriptions, I instantly pictured a stand-up comedian absolutely bombing on stage.
The psychology of a stand-up comedian losing a crowd and a military leader losing their squadron is functionally identical. Both rely on projecting authority and competence.
Let's diagnose those nonverbal quirks. The life raft is the speaker who walks up to the podium and grips the edges so tightly their knuckles turn white.
Yes. They anchor themselves to the furniture because they are terrified of the open space of the stage.
I have absolutely done that. You feel like if you let go of the podium, you'll just float away. And the caged tiger is the pacer, right? The person who walks relentlessly back and forth across the stage.
They are bleeding off nervous energy, but to the audience, it looks like a trapped animal. It exhausts the listener to watch them pace like that.
The rocker is similarly distracting, swaying back and forth from heels to toes while standing in one place.
It creates a hypnotic, distracting rhythm that detracts from the data being presented.
And what about the too cool speaker?
That is an overcompensation mechanism. The speaker is internally terrified, but to mask it, they adopt a persona of complete detachment. They lean back, they don't make eye contact, they act like they don't care about the material.
Oh, I've seen that. They think they look composed.
They do! But the audience interprets it as arrogance and apathy.
Why does a military leadership manual dedicate space to telling people not to sway on their heels? I mean, is it really that big of a deal if the data on their PowerPoint is correct?
It is a massive deal because the text explicitly states that over 50% of the meaning in any face-to-face message is communicated non-verbally.
Over 50%.
Yes. Your posture, your eye contact, your tone, these are the dominant channels of information.
So you could have the perfect plan, totally supported by data, but if you deliver it while rocking on your heels and staring at the floor, what actually happens?
The audience unconsciously rejects the data because they reject the messenger. If a technical sergeant is briefing a critical, dangerous operation to a room of 20-year-old airmen, and the sergeant is displaying the caged tiger pacing or the life raft grip, the airmen don't think, oh, the sergeant is just not a good public speaker.
Right. They think, the sergeant is terrified. The plan must be flawed. We are in danger.
Exactly. They transfer the speaker's anxiety onto the mission itself. The leader's nonverbal communication actively degrades the credibility of the operation. That is the real-world consequence of failing to master delivery.
And that rigorous demand for precision applies to written communication, too. I always assumed military paperwork was just, endless, mindless bureaucracy.
It is highly structured, not mindless.
Right. The manual outlines a highly standardized architecture of papers. It's not just send an email. There are specific rigid formats for different tasks. You have the point paper, the talking paper, the bullet background paper, the position paper, and the staff study. Why so many?
Because precision in written communication acts as a filtering mechanism for decision makers. A commander might have 50 decisions to make in a single day.
They don't have time to read essays.
Exactly. They need information packaged in an exact, predictable format so they can process it rapidly. Let's look at the functional utility of each.
Let's do it. What is a point paper?
A point paper is a memory jogger. It is heavily condensed, usually a single page with minimal text. It is used to quickly inform someone about a single issue, often with zero notice. You hand it to a commander as they are walking down the hallway.
How does that differ from a talking paper?
A talking paper is slightly more robust. It is a quick reference outline used specifically when a speaker is giving a planned oral presentation. It provides the bullet points they need to hit so they don't lose their train of thought.
Okay, then you have the bullet background paper.
That is used for historical context. If a new commander takes over a squadron, a technical sergeant might write a bullet background paper to explain the history of an ongoing maintenance problem. It doesn't solve the problem, it just brings the reader up to speed on how we got here.
But if they actually want to solve the problem, they use a position paper.
Correct. A position paper is fundamentally different from the first three. The first three are informative. A position paper is advocacy. You are taking a stance.
You're trying to convince them of something.
You are circulating a proposal, evaluating the alternatives, and explicitly advocating for a specific course of action to the decision maker.
And the final one, the heavy hitter, is the staff study.
The staff study is a comprehensive, multi-page research document. It is deployed for highly complex systemic problems. It analyzes the root causes, details the methodology, draws formal conclusions, and makes definitive, data-backed recommendations.
And all of these documents are often routed using something called a staff summary sheet, the AF Form 1768.
The SSS, or the Triple S. It's the cover page that acts as an executive summary for the entire package behind it.
I'm trying to visualize the Level C application here. Let's say I'm a technical sergeant. I've noticed a massive flaw in our weekly training schedule. It's causing burnout. I want the commander to change the policy. If I just write up a talking paper and slap a Triple S on it, What happens?
You trigger systemic friction.
How so?
The commander looks at the package expecting a rigorous argument with data and alternatives. Because you are advocating for a policy change, which requires a position paper or a staff study, instead they receive a skeletal outline meant for a speech.
They get a cheat sheet instead of a thesis.
Exactly. The commander cannot make a legally or operationally sound decision based on a talking paper. So the package gets kicked back, time is lost, the airmen continue to burn out, and the technical sergeant's administrative competence is permanently scarred.
It's not just a formatting error.
Using the wrong paper is not a typo. It is a failure to understand the machinery of military decision-making.
So if we pull all of this together, mastering your internal mindset, managing your physiological stress response, and communicating flawlessly through nonverbal cues and rigid paperwork, that is just the foundation.
That is merely the cost of entry.
That is just what it takes to manage yourself. But a technical sergeant doesn't operate in a vacuum.
No, they operate in the meso level, the middle tier. They have to take that internal stability and project it outward onto a chaotic, unpredictable team of human beings.
Which is the perfect transition into the next major block of our deep dive. Developing others. We are moving from the mind of the leader to the psychology of the team.
And Chapter 14 dives right into the mechanics of team building.
It really strips away any romanticized notion that teams just naturally get along. It outlines 4 inevitable, unavoidable stages of team dynamics: forming, storming, norming, and performing.
It is a biological and sociological inevitability. You cannot throw 5 strangers together and expect high performance on day 1.
Let's walk through the stages. Forming makes sense. That's day 1. Everyone is polite. They are cautious.
They are trying to figure out the boundaries and figure out who the alpha is without stepping on any toes.
Right. It is the honeymoon phase. Productivity is actually quite low because cognitive energy is being spent on social mapping rather than the task.
And then the honeymoon ends.
And we hit the danger zone. Storming. This is the phase I really want to unpack because this is where things get ugly. The polite veneer wears off, people realize the mission is harder than they thought, and personalities start clashing.
Conflict becomes explicit.
And the manual specifically warns technical sergeants to look out for a behavior called all-starring. What is all-starring?
All-starring is a symptom of a severe power struggle within the group. It occurs when one team member decides to aggressively attempt to outshine everyone else.
They want to be the hero.
They want the recognition, and they actively try to dominate the group's processes to prove their superiority.
This is the toxic high performer. I've worked with this person in corporate sales. They hoard the best leads, they talk over people in meetings, and they don't care who they throw under the bus, as long as their individual numbers look good.
And in a military context, a toxic high performer is a catastrophic threat to unit cohesion. If a technical sergeant observes all-starring during the storming phase and fails to intervene, the downstream effects are devastating.
Walk me through that fallout. If the leader just says, hey, they're getting results, let them be a jerk, what happens to the rest of the team?
Trust completely evaporates. When the rest of the team realizes that the all-star is actively working against them for personal glory, psychological safety is destroyed.
So they stop collaborating.
Team members will stop communicating openly. They will actively begin hoarding and withholding vital information from one another simply out of self-preservation.
Because if I share my data with the all-star, they'll just steal the credit. So I keep my mouth shut.
Exactly. The team fractures into warring factions. Instead of fighting the adversary or solving the maintenance issue, they are fighting each other.
And the mission suffers.
Deadlines are missed, safety protocols are bypassed because of a lack of communication, and the mission fails. It creates immense administrative wreckage.
So how does the leader actually fix it? How do you neutralize the all-star and push the team into the next phases, norming and performing?
The Level C application is immediate structural intervention. The technical sergeant cannot just ask everyone to play nice. They must forcefully step in and strictly redefine the boundaries.
What does that look like in practice?
They must explicitly reiterate each person's specific role, responsibility, and area of authority. By drawing hard lines around what each person is accountable for, you neutralize the all-star's ability to trespass on someone else's territory. You enforce collaboration by making individual success impossible without team success.
That makes a lot of sense. You build walls so they stop stepping on each other's toes. But stepping in and drawing those lines means the leader has to initiate conflict. And this manual has a really counterintuitive take on conflict.
It does. It views it as a utility.
Right. It says that conflict is not just inevitable. It is actually necessary for a high-performing team.
Yes. The absence of conflict usually indicates apathy or fear, not harmony. Positive, constructive conflict forces a team to debate alternatives, uncover blind spots, and innovate.
The goal is not to eliminate conflict, but to manage it. To do that, the Air Force relies on a framework called Dr. Kenneth Thomas's conflict management styles.
It's a very precise diagnostic tool.
I've seen this plotted on a graph. It takes every possible response to conflict and plots it on two axes. The vertical axis is assertiveness, how hard you fight to get what you want. The horizontal axis is cooperativeness, how willing you are to give the other person what they want.
And this creates 5 distinct styles of managing a fight. Let's map those out, because a technical sergeant must know exactly when to deploy each style based on the operational constraints.
The first one is competing, which some people call forcing. This is high assertiveness and low cooperativeness. You do not care about the other person's feelings. You're using your authority to overwhelm them and win. When is it ever okay for a leader to just crush the opposition like that? Doesn't that ruin morale?
It does damage social capital, which is why it is reserved for specific scenarios. A leader uses the competing style in an absolute emergency, or when an unpopular, decisive action must be taken immediately.
Give me a scenario.
Imagine a flight line. Jet engines are screening. A junior airman is about to unwittingly walk into the intake hazard area of an F-35. The technical sergeant doesn't pull out a whiteboard and say, hey, let's collaborate on a safety solution.
Right. They yell, stop right there or I will tackle you.
Exactly. They use formal authority to force compliance instantly. Because the cost of failure is a human life, there is no time for debate.
Okay. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have accommodating. This is low assertiveness and high cooperativeness.
Yeah.
You basically just fold. You give the other person whatever they want. Why would a military leader ever just give up?
A strategic leader uses accommodating when they realize they are objectively wrong, or when the issue at hand is incredibly important to the other person but trivial to the leader.
Like letting the team pick the music playing in the hangar?
Precisely. By yielding on a low-stakes issue, the leader builds goodwill and social capital that they can cash in later when a high-stakes issue arises. It is a strategic retreat.
Then we have the one everyone hates, avoiding. Low assertiveness, low cooperativeness. You just pretend the conflict isn't happening.
The clinical fallout of relying on avoiding as a primary strategy is severe. Leaders often trick themselves into thinking, if I ignore it, it will just blow over.
It never blows over.
The text warns that unresolved conflict rarely blows over. It festers. It metastasizes. The resentment grows in the dark until it explodes into a much larger crisis. A TSGT should only use effects. Avoiding if the issue is so trivial it isn't worth the breath, or if they have zero chance of ever satisfying their concerns. Otherwise, avoiding is just cowardice.
Now let's look at the middle ground, compromising. Moderate assertiveness, moderate cooperativeness. Both sides give up a little bit of what they want to reach an agreement.
Compromising is a partial win, partial loss for everyone. It is useful when 2 equally powerful parties are committed to mutually exclusive goals, or when you are under moderate time pressure and just need a workable solution, even if it isn't perfect.
Which brings us to the holy grail of conflict resolution, collaborating. High assertiveness, high cooperativeness. The true win-win where you find a solution that completely satisfies everyone.
Collaborating is the ideal state, but it has a massive operational cost. Time.
You can't collaborate if the building is on fire.
You cannot collaborate in an emergency. It requires extensive debate, deep listening, and a pre-existing foundation of immense trust. You deploy collaborating for highly complex problems where both sets of concerns are too critical to be compromised.
So the true skill, the level C application, isn't just defaulting to one style. It's diagnosing the situation. If the building is on fire, you use competing. If you have a month to design a new schedule, you use collaborating. It is entirely conditional.
Exactly. And that conditional approach bridges the gap between simply managing a situation and truly leading people.
I'm glad you brought up the difference between managing and leading because the handbook drops this incredible quote from Dr. Warren G. Bennis to highlight the difference. He wrote, "Management is getting people to do what needs to be done. Leadership is getting people to want to do what needs to be done."
It perfectly encapsulates the dichotomy. Management is about structural order. It is consistency, resource allocations, schedules, and metrics.
And leadership.
Leadership is the human element. It is inspiration, psychological alignment, and convincing an individual to internalize the mission as their own.
And to explain how you actually get someone to want to do the job, the military text pulls out a classic concept from civilian psychology. Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I remember studying this in college, but seeing it applied to combat readiness is fascinating.
It is the ultimate diagnostic tool for human motivation. Maslow's pyramid posits that human needs are arranged in a strict hierarchy.
Right, at the foundational base, you have basic physiological needs: food, water, sleep, shelter.
The next level up is safety and security. Physical safety, but also job security and financial stability.
Above that is the need for belonging and love, feeling accepted by your peers and your team. Then comes esteem, the need for respect, recognition, and a sense of accomplishment.
And finally, at the very peak of the pyramid is self-actualization.
Self-actualization.
Self-actualization is the realization of one's absolute maximum potential. It is peak creativity, profound problem-solving, and total dedication. That is the state a leader wants their team to operate in.
But the catch is, you can't skip steps, right?
That is the systemic logic of the pyramid. A technical sergeant cannot demand self-actualization from a junior airman if that airman's foundational needs are threatened.
Walk me through a real-world scenario of that.
Imagine you have a brilliant young mechanic. Suddenly, their performance plummets. They are distracted, making errors, and showing zero initiative.
So what does a bad leader do?
A poor leader, one who relies purely on management, might just yell at them or offer a generic inspirational speech about duty and excellence, demanding they return to peak performance.
Demanding self-actualization.
Yes, but the leader failed to diagnose the pyramid. What if that airman's spouse just lost their job and they are terrified of eviction?
Oh, wow. So their safety need is gone.
Their safety and security need is fundamentally compromised. Their brain is biologically incapable of caring about the abstract concept of squadron excellence because it is entirely consumed by a threat to their survival base.
So the inspirational speech is totally useless. It's just noise.
Worse than useless, it demonstrates to the airmen that the leader is blind to their reality, which destroys the belonging need as well.
So what's the Level C application?
The Level C leadership application is to diagnose the deficit. The TSGT must sit down with that airman, uncover the financial crisis, and connect them with military financial aid resources. Once the security need is restabilized, the airman will naturally climb back up the pyramid towards self-actualization.
That is profound. You don't fix the performance, you fix the foundation, and the performance fixes itself. But uncovering those root issues requires the leader to actually talk to their people. It requires counseling.
It requires formal mentoring.
And the manual breaks down mentoring and counseling in a way that completely shattered my preconceived notions. Let's look at the mentoring acronym they use.
It is a comprehensive checklist for leader-follower development. Model, you must lead by impeccable example. Empathize, you must show genuine, authentic compassion for their struggles.
Nurture.
Nurture, you must invest time and emotional patience in their growth. Teach, organize your knowledge logically and correct their errors immediately but respectfully. Organize, have a deliberate long-term plan for the protege's career.
Let's finish the acronym. Respond, actively listen to their questions instead of just waiting for your turn to speak. Inspire, elevate their expectations of themselves. Network, connect them with resources and people outside their immediate circle. And goal set, ensure their targets are SMART, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound.
It covers every base.
Now, I'll have to stop and push back on the nurture and empathize parts. When civilians think of military counseling, we picture a senior-ranking person sitting behind a desk shouting at a subordinate, telling them exactly what they did wrong and exactly how to fix it. It's an entirely directive process. Do they really nurture?
That assumption is a Hollywood fabrication. The text actually outlines 3 distinct approaches to counseling: directive, non-directive, and combined. And the handbook explicitly states that the non-directive approach is the preferred method for the vast majority of counseling sessions.
Okay, what does a non-directive counseling session actually sound like?
In a non-directive session, the leader's primary job is to keep their mouth shut. They ask open-ended questions and they actively listen.
Give me an example.
If an airman is consistently late to formation, the leader doesn't say, "You are late, buy an alarm clock, do 50 push-ups." Instead, they ask, "I've noticed a pattern of tardiness. Walk me through what your mornings look like."
So you force the airmen to explain themselves. But what if they just make excuses? Don't you have to tell them how to fix it?
No, that is the trap. The underlying psychology of non-directive counseling is that you force the subordinate to take personal responsibility for the solution.
Oh, I see.
The leader guides the conversation, but the airman must architect the plan of action. The leader asks, "What do you think is the best way to ensure you are here 15 minutes prior to formation?"
Why is that so crucial? Why not just give them the answer? It'd be so much faster.
Because if you solve their problem for them, you are robbing them of the opportunity to build the cognitive neural pathways of critical thinking. You are creating a dependency.
They become reliant on you.
If a technical sergeant constantly dictates solutions, the moment that TSGT is not around, the airman is paralyzed. Non-directive counseling develops maturity and self-reliance.
That is brilliant. So when is the classic directive approach actually used?
Directive counseling, where the leader does most of the talking and explicitly outlines the solution, is reserved for very specific parameters. It is used for simple on-the-spot corrections, like fixing a uniform violation.
Or in an emergency?
Yes. It is used in emergencies when time is incredibly short. Or it is used when the subordinate is so inexperienced, or their problem-solving skills are so severely underdeveloped that they desperately need a rigid framework just to function.
But the manual gives a stark warning about relying on the directive approach too heavily.
Yes, the collateral damage of chronic directive counseling is that you end up treating symptoms, not root causes. You are putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
So what's the middle ground?
The best leaders often use the combined approach. They blend the two. They listen non-directively to uncover the root cause. They offer a few potential options, but they ultimately require the airman to choose the path forward and own the consequences.
This nuanced view of how much control a leader should exert is formalized in what the Air Force calls full-range leadership development, or FRLD. This is a fascinating spectrum of leadership behaviors. It maps out everything from the absolute worst type of boss to the absolute best.
FRLD views leadership not as a static trait, but as a dynamic system comprised of the leader, the follower, and the situational context. Let's walk the spectrum, starting from the baseline of failure.
At the very bottom, on the dangerous end of the spectrum, you have laissez-faire leadership.
Laissez-faire is the literal abandonment of responsibility. The leader is physically present but psychologically absent.
The worst kind of boss.
They hide in their office, they hesitate to make decisions, and they view their subordinates' developmental needs as an annoyance.
I've had bosses like this. They just want to collect a paycheck and not be bothered. What happens to a military unit under a laissez-faire leader?
It devolves into chaos. High performers leave or become deeply cynical. Low performers run wild because there is no accountability, and trust in the chain of command is annihilated.
Stepping slightly up from the bottom, you have management by exception passive. I call this the firefighter style.
That is an accurate description. This leader operates on the philosophy of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They sit back and only intervene when rules are explicitly broken or a catastrophic failure has already occurred.
It is entirely reactive.
It's slightly better than laissez-faire because there is at least the threat of accountability, but it does absolutely nothing to improve the unit.
Then we cross the line into active management. Next is management by exception active.
This is a highly structured, highly controlled system. The leader provides detailed instructions and actively monitors compliance to catch errors before they happen.
Which sounds good on paper.
It is very effective in high-risk environments like a munitions depot where a single mistake is fatal.
But the text warns about using it too much, right?
Yes, because if used everywhere, the leader is perceived as an overbearing micromanager. It kills innovation because subordinates are terrified of deviating from the checklist.
Next on the spectrum is contingent rewards. This is classic transactional leadership.
It is a contractual relationship. You perform task X, and I will give you reward Y. It could be a day off, a positive performance report, or an award.
It's a bribe, essentially.
It is highly effective for ensuring baseline performance standards are met. However, it rarely inspires people to go above and beyond because their motivation is entirely external. They are working for the reward, not for the mission.
Which brings us to the absolute pinnacle of the FRLD spectrum, the gold standard, transformational leadership. This is defined by what the manual calls the 4 I's.
Let's define the 4 I's because this is what the Air Force desperately wants its technical surgeons to achieve. First, individualized consideration. This is nurturing followers, acting as a mentor, and treating each airman as a unique individual with specific needs, not just a cog in the machine.
Second is intellectual stimulation.
This means actively encouraging subordinates to challenge the status quo. The leader demands independent thinking and protects airmen who take calculated risks, even if they fail.
Third is inspirational motivation.
The ability to articulate a compelling, optimistic vision of the future. The leader connects the mundane daily tasks of the team to the grand strategic purpose of the Air Force. They give the work profound meaning.
And finally, idealized influence.
Leading by profound moral example. The leader doesn't just talk about core values, they embody them. They share the risks with their team. They walk the walk.
A transformational leader creates a team that is intrinsically motivated.
Yeah.
The airmen aren't performing because they are afraid of the micromanager, and they aren't performing because they want a transactional reward. They perform because they genuinely believe in the vision, and they refuse to let their leader down.
It is the ultimate force multiplier. But here is the critical pivot that the Level B and Level C framework demands we acknowledge.
Okay, what's the catch?
A technical sergeant can be a perfect transformational leader. They can master their own psychological responses, flawlessly resolve all interpersonal conflict, push their entire team to the top of Maslow's pyramid of self-actualization,
Right.
and the mission can still end in total failure.
Because you can have the best, most motivated crew in the world.
Right.
But if the ship they are sailing on has a massive hole in the hull, leadership alone isn't going to keep you dry. You have to know how to fix the machine itself.
Exactly. If the overarching system, the policies, or the organizational structure is fundamentally broken, human motivation is not enough. The technical sergeant must shift from being a tactical leader of people to being a strategic architect of systems.
Which brings us to our final act, Section 3. The machine. We are moving to the macro level. Developing organizations. This covers strategic thinking, massive diagnostic frameworks, change management, and continuous improvement.
To operate at this macro level, the leader must adopt a strategic thinking mindset. The manual defines this through 3 core components: intellectual flexibility, intellectual inclusiveness, and intellectual humility.
Let's unpack those. Intellectual flexibility seems obvious. You have to be willing to change your mind.
It's the willingness to adapt your approach when contradictory new information arises without abandoning the long-term objective. It's bending the tactic without breaking the strategy.
Intellectual inclusiveness means you actively seek out diverse, non-traditional sources of information. You don't just ask the people in your echo chamber who already agree with you.
And my favorite, intellectual humility.
It is the most critical and the most difficult.
Intellectual humility is being deeply comfortable with the fact that you might be wrong. It is examining every crisis as if your initial assumptions are deeply flawed. Without humility, strategic thinking is impossible because ego prevents the assimilation of uncomfortable data.
And the text applies this concept of ego directly to how organizations structure their metrics and goals. It explicitly warns against egocentric goals.
Yes, the system logic here is fascinating. An egocentric goal is a metric that maximizes individual results at the expense of the team.
Give me an example of that.
If you run a cyber help desk and you evaluate your airmen based on who closes the most tickets individually, you have created an egocentric goal.
Right. And the downstream effect of that is terrible. If I'm evaluated solely on my own ticket numbers, I am heavily disincentivized from pausing my work to train the new guy. Why would I help him if it drops my stats and hurts my performance report?
Exactly. The metric drives the behavior, and the behavior destroys collaboration. The manual dictates that leaders must design group-centric goals. If the entire help desk is evaluated on the squadron's total ticket closure rate, suddenly the senior technicians are highly incentivized to train the juniors because a rising tide lifts all boats.
To ensure they're looking at all these interconnected variables, the Department of Defense uses a massive, overarching diagnostic checklist. It's an acronym, DOTMLPF.
It is a holistic framework designed to ensure no systemic variable is missed when architecting a solution.
Let's run through the letters. Doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership and education, personnel, and facilities.
Okay, let's ground this in reality.
Yeah, give me an extended scenario where a technical sergeant actually has to use DOTMLPF. Let's say a maintenance squadron is consistently failing safety inspections on their vehicles.
A poor leader looks at that failure and immediately blames the airmen. They're lazy, they lack discipline, I need to yell at them more.
Right, the typical response.
But a strategic leader runs the failure through DOTMLPF to isolate the true variable. First, doctrine. Are our baseline procedures and technical manuals actually correct and updated?
Organization. Is the maintenance squadron structured efficiently, or are we confusing the chain of command?
Training. Did these mechanics actually receive the specialized courses for this new vehicle type?
Material. Do we actually have the right agnostic computers, spare parts, and wrenches to do the job? It's crazy how often people blame human error when the material is just broken.
Exactly. Continuing down the list. Leadership. Are the commanding officers prioritizing speed over safety, implicitly encouraging corner cutting?
Personnel. Do we simply have too few bodies to accomplish the workload?
Facilities. Is the maintenance bay well lit, or are they trying to inspect an engine in the dark? Is it freezing cold, degrading their manual dexterity?
If the real problem is that the hangar is freezing and poorly lit, which is facilities, and they don't have the right wrenches, which is material, yelling at them to work harder will literally accomplish nothing.
It wastes time, ruins morale, and the safety failures will continue. DOTMLPF forces the leader to see the invisible structures holding the team back.
And a massive part of that organization letter in DOTMLPF is understanding how the very structure of the unit dictates the flow of information. The manual outlines 4 types of organizational structures: mechanistic, organic, diverse, and matrix.
Let's contrast these. A mechanistic structure is what most people picture when they think of the military. It's a bureaucracy.
Highly vertical. Decisions flow strictly from the top down. There are rigid rules, heavy standardization, and narrow task specialization.
It is incredibly efficient for routine, highly stable tasks, like processing payroll or running a supply depot. But the clinical fallout of a purely mechanistic structure is notoriously low job satisfaction because the workers at the bottom have zero creative input. They are just executing orders.
Contrast that with an organic structure.
An organic structure is decentralized. Communication flows horizontally as well as vertically. It is highly flexible, deeply collaborative, and thrives on rapid innovation. Think of a specialized cyber warfare cell or a Silicon Valley startup.
But organic has its downsides too, right?
Absolutely. Because everyone is constantly collaborating and debating, implementation can slow to a crawl, standardization drops, which can lead to chaotic results.
So most large entities, including the Air Force, use a diverse structure. They blend the two based on the specific needs of the department. You want your nuclear weapons security team to be highly mechanistic, rigid rules, no deviations. But you might want your threat analysis intelligence team to be organic so they can brainstorm out-of-the-box ideas.
Correct. But then the manual introduces the 4th structure, which is the most volatile, the matrix structure.
Anyone listening to this who works in corporate tech or project management just felt a shiver down their spine. The matrix.
A matrix structure is temporary. It pulls subject matter experts from various different functional departments and pulls them together for a specific short-term project.
So you pull a comms guy, a logistics guy, and a medic, and you put them on a special task force. What is the fundamental weakness of the matrix design that a leader has to look out for?
Command confusion. The profound danger of the matrix is that the individual airman suddenly has 2 bosses.
The absolute worst-case scenario in any job.
Yes. They have their original functional boss, the person who writes their annual performance report and controls their long-term career, and they have their temporary project boss, who is directing their daily tasks on the task force.
If those 2 bosses have conflicting priorities, what happens? Let's say the project boss says, I need you working 12-hour shifts to finish this deployment plan. But the functional boss says, I need you to drop everything and complete this mandatory week-long training course.
The subordinate is crushed in the middle of a bureaucratic turf war. The administrative wreckage is severe stress, paralysis, and project failure.
How does the TSGT handle that?
The Level C application for the technical sergeant is to recognize when a matrix structure is failing and forcefully intervene to align the priorities of the 2 commanders, shielding the airmen from the crossfire.
So assuming you've analyzed your DOTMLPF, you've diagnosed your organizational structure, and you realize that a massive systemic change is required, you have to alter the status quo. To explain how to do this safely, the manual introduces Kurt Lewin's 3-stage change process.
Kurt Lewin was a pioneering social psychologist, and his model for organizational change is brutally elegant. Stage 1, unfreezing. Stage 2, changing. Stage 3, refreezing.
When I first read this, the analogy that immediately popped into my head was the process of a blacksmith forging a sword.
It is a perfect physical metaphor for a deeply psychological process. Let's expand on that.
If you take a cold, rigid piece of steel, which represents an organization locked in its old habits, and you just take a hammer and start beating on it, what happens?
The metal doesn't change shape. It either shatters into pieces or the hammer just bounces off, exhausting the blacksmith.
Exactly. The team revolts or they just ignore the new policy.
Yeah.
To actually change the shape of the metal, you have to put it into the forge. You have to apply heat until the metal glows red and becomes soft and malleable. That is stage 1, unfreezing.
In an organization, unfreezing is the deliberate strategic management activity of creating the felt need for change. You cannot just announce a new software system or a new shift schedule.
You have to explain why.
You have to highlight the severe pain and the critical flaws in the old system. You have to show the team the data proving that the status quo is failing them. You heat up the environment until the discomfort of staying the same is greater than the fear of changing.
You make them want the change. Only then do you pull the metal out of the forge and strike it with the hammer. That is stage 2, changing. You modify the tasks, you introduce the new software, you shape the hot metal.
And this is the most volatile stage of the entire process. The change agent must closely monitor the people affected. There will be confusion, anxiety, and a dip in productivity. The leader must provide massive logistical and emotional support. If you strike the metal incorrectly or if you don't support the metal while hitting it, you ruin the blade.
But here's the part where most leaders fail. Once the sword has the new shape, you can't just set it on the anvil and walk away. If you leave it hot, it will eventually lose its edge, or the metal will warp back toward its original shape. You have to plunge it into a barrel of oil or water. You quench it. You lock the molecular structure into its new, final, rigid form. That is stage 3, refreezing.
Refreezing is locking in the new norms so they become permanent. The heat is gone. It is the active evaluation of the results, and crucially, it is the positive reinforcement of the desired outcomes.
You have to reward them for doing it right.
You must publicly reward the people who are using the new system correctly. You integrate the new behavior into the permanent training manuals. If a leader skips the refreezing stage, the organization's natural gravity will slowly pull everyone back to the old, comfortable way of doing things.
And if you don't manage this 3-step process well, you hit a massive wall of human resistance. The text lists the specific forms this resistance takes: distrust, uncertainty, self-interest, and overdetermination. And if a leader gets frustrated by that resistance and decides to skip the unfreezing process entirely and just tries to force the change through using coercion, what happens?
Coercion is a brute forcing technique. Do this new process immediately because I outrank you and I ordered you to.
And what's the real-world consequence of that?
The consequence is that coerced compliance requires constant, exhausting, 24/7 leadership oversight. The very second the leader leaves the room, the compliance stops and the team reverts to the old way. Coercion degrades trust, builds massive resentment, and guarantees that the systemic change will fail the moment pressure is removed.
Which is exactly why the Air Force prefers Structured Continuous Improvement, or CI. They want systemic change driven by data, not by screaming. And they draw on 4 major civilian methodologies to build their framework: Lean, Six Sigma, Business Process Reengineering, and the Theory of Constraints. Let's define these briefly.
Lean focuses obsessively on the elimination of non-value-added waste in a workflow. Six Sigma is a rigorous, deeply statistical method aimed at reducing variation and defects in a product.
Business process reengineering is the nuclear option. It is tearing down a flawed process to its foundations and redesigning it from scratch.
And the theory of constraints is all about identifying and optimizing the single biggest bottleneck that is slowing down the entire system.
The Air Force takes the best parts of those 4 concepts and synthesizes them into the practical problem-solving method. It is an 8-step process. Let's walk through this because this isn't just military doctrine. This is a clinical blueprint for fixing anything in your life or business.
Step 1. Clarify and validate the problem. You must use empirical data, not emotional assumptions, to define the exact gap between your current performance and the desired standard.
Step 2. Break down the problem and identify performance gaps. You slice the data to find the specific localized opportunities for improvement.
Step 3. Set improvement targets. Define what the ideal end state looks like with measurable, achievable goals.
Now, step 4 is where things usually go completely off the rails. Step 4 is determine root cause. The manual notes that identifying the wrong root cause is the single most common and most destructive mistake made during any continuous improvement effort.
Because it is human nature to treat the visible symptom rather than the invisible underlying disease, consider a simple mechanical analogy. The symptom is a puddle of oil on the hangar floor. If you do a poor root cause analysis, your solution is to buy a more absorbent mop.
You fixed the puddle, but you didn't fix the problem.
Exactly. The correct root cause analysis leads you to discover the degraded gasket inside the engine block, and you replace the gasket. If a technical sergeant misdiagnoses step 4, every single ounce of money, time, and manpower spent on steps 5 through 8 is completely wasted.
Assuming you actually find the gasket and get the root cause right, you move to step 5. Develop countermeasures. Find practical, sustainable solutions.
Step 6. See countermeasures through. Execute the plan, implement the fix, and track the milestones.
Step 7. Confirm results and process. Check the new performance data against the targets you set back in Step 3. Did the fix actually stop the bleeding?
And finally, Step 8. Standardize successful processes. The handbook explicitly warns that this is the most commonly neglected step in the entire military.
I see this in the corporate world all the time. You fix the massive crisis, everyone high-fives, you get a pat on the back, and you immediately move on to the next fire. Why is moving on a mistake?
Because if you don't codify the fix, if you don't update the official technical manuals, if you don't inform the broader chain of command, and if you don't share the new process across the enterprise, you haven't actually improved the organization. You have only temporarily improved your local workspace.
Because the knowledge leaves when you do.
The moment you transfer to a new base, your unit will forget the unwritten fix and the problem will return. Step 8 is what scales a local solution into an enterprise-wide evolution.
And managing these types of systemic improvements brings us to the fundamental, unavoidable reality of project management constraints. The manual outlines the iron triangle. Every single mission, every project operates inside a rigid triangle of constraints: quality, time, and cost.
Quality is the technical specification, how good the product must be. Time is the deadline. Cost is the budget, but also the manpower, the physical materials, and the resources required.
The systemic logic here is that you cannot manipulate one corner of the triangle without directly impacting the other two. They are inextricably linked.
Exactly. If a commander suddenly cuts your project timeline in half, you only have two options. You either have to drastically increase the cost by hiring twice as many contractors and buying faster equipment, or you have to drastically reduce the quality of the final product.
You can't have it all.
A technical sergeant must deeply understand this calculus to prevent overcommitting their team and failing the mission. When a superior asks for something faster, the leader must reply, "Understood. Will we be increasing the budget or lowering the standard?"
To manage that massive balancing act, they use a tool called a work breakdown structure, or WBS. They take a massive, overwhelming project, like moving an entire squadron to a new base, and they slice it down into highly manageable subunits or work packages.
The WBS ensures that absolutely no essential step is overlooked in the chaos, and they pair the WBS with task analysis. This is where they take those small work packages, sequence them in the correct chronological order, establish hard milestones, and assign specific resources to each phase. It is the architectural blueprint of execution.
Okay, wow. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We really need to synthesize this.
We started inside the mind of the individual leader, analyzing physiological stress and cognitive load. We moved through the complex, often toxic dynamics of human teams and conflict resolution. And we ended with the architectural restructuring of massive organizational systems and change management.
What stands out to me the most is how this totally shatters the civilian stereotype of the military. The Air Force does not just rely on rank and screaming to get things done. It is a highly sophisticated, clinically rigorous, data-driven system.
It has to be. The stakes are too high for anything else.
Right. It requires its mid-level leaders, these technical sergeants, to master their own cardiovascular responses to threat, to deeply understand human motivation and conflict styles, and to apply massive analytical frameworks to reorganize the reality around them.
And here's the aha moment for me, looking at all these sources. While this is strictly military doctrine designed for the projection of air and cyber power, the underlying truth is universal.
It applies everywhere.
This manual is incredibly applicable to civilian life, to corporate management, and to personal growth. Because organizational failure, whether it's an Air Force fighter squadron, a Fortune 500 tech company, or a local charity, almost always stems from the exact same roots. It is always a failure to correctly manage human resistance during change, or a failure to correctly identify the root cause of a problem.
It's all just people and systems. If you misdiagnose the human element, the system breaks. You can have the best work breakdown structure in the world, but if your team is stuck in the storming phase and hiding data from each other, the project fails.
Precisely. The human friction will always override the systemic elegance if left unmanaged.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day. Let's strip away the military context for a second and bring this right back to your own life.
Right.
We talked at the very beginning about how the manual states that self-control is a limited, depletable resource, much like a physical muscle, and how environmental design is far superior to relying on internal discipline. Look at your own daily routine. Look at the places where you consistently fall short of your own expectations, whether it's doom scrolling at night, snapping at your partner after a long day, or procrastinating on a major project. Are you failing at those goals because you genuinely lack character and discipline?
Probably not.
Or are you simply relying entirely on your finite internal willpower to fight a poorly designed environment? Think about the friction in your life. Instead of just trying to force yourself to be better or try harder, how can you architecturally restructure your environment to remove the trigger in the first place? Are you treating the symptom of your failure, or are you actually addressing the root cause? It's a question worth asking. Until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive.